In the mid-19th century, China was breaking apart. The Qing dynasty, once strong and mighty, had grown weak and corrupt. Famines plagued the countryside. Opium addiction hollowed out cities. Foreign powers carved up Chinese ports, demanding trade rights and territory. For millions of Chinese peasants, life had become unbearable. Out of this chaos rose one of the deadliest movements in human history, led by a man who claimed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. His name was Hong Xiuquan. He was not a general. He was not a nobleman. He was a failed civil service student from southern China who, after suffering a mental breakdown and a series of visions, declared that God had chosen him to destroy the Qing dynasty and build a new heavenly kingdom on earth. At first, people laughed, but soon they started listening. Hong's vision was intoxicating to the poor. He promised a China where land was shared equally, where men and women were treated the same, where there would be no corruption, no foot binding, no idol worship, and no foreign influence. This new society would be built by the righteous, and it would be defended by a holy army. He called it the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. The poor flocked to him, the hungry, the abused, the desperate. They came in the thousands, then the millions. His followers, known as the God worshippers, were trained to believe that this was not a rebellion. It was a divine mission. They cut their hair in defiance of Manchu customs. They smashed Confucian altars. They renamed cities and towns after biblical locations. And they prepared for war. By 1851, the movement had transformed into a full-scale uprising. And very quickly, it became a civil war unlike anything China or the world had ever seen. The Taiping army was brutal, disciplined, and fanatical. They marched in neat columns, wore red uniforms, and sang hymns as they fought. But beneath the religious chants and military drills was a boiling violence waiting to explode. The rebellion spread across southern China like wildfire. Entire provinces fell. In 1853, the Taiping forces captured Nanjing, one of China's most important cities. They renamed it Tianjin, or the heavenly capital. From here, they would govern the parts of China they controlled and prepare to expand their holy war across the empire. Inside this so-called paradise, the reality was far from divine. Hong Xiuquan, once a humble preacher, had become an emperor. He ruled from behind silk curtains, issuing decrees from a golden throne. His word was law, dissent was heresy, and punishment for disobedience could be swift and merciless. Under Hong's rule, society was reshaped from the ground up. Men and women were strictly separated. Even husbands and wives were forced to live apart unless they received permission to reunite. Dancing, drinking, gambling, and anything considered sinful was banned. Scholars were dismissed, Confucian teachings were burned, and still, people obeyed, because those who questioned the rules were executed. But the worst was yet to come. As the movement grew, so did its hunger for control. Rival leaders within the Taiping ranks began to fight among themselves. Power struggles led to purges. Thousands of Hong's own followers were killed, sometimes for plotting rebellion, sometimes for no reason at all. His once righteous court began to resemble the corrupt dynasties he had sworn to destroy. Meanwhile, the Qing dynasty struck back. Desperate to stop the spread of rebellion, it unleashed massive military campaigns across the south. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, entire populations were driven from their homes. And as the countryside turned to ash, famine took root. Food shortages became widespread. Cities were surrounded by both Qing and Taiping forces, cutting off supply routes. Millions were trapped between armies. With nothing left to eat, people turned to roots, bark, and eventually, each other. Reports of cannibalism began to spread. Parents fed on the bodies of their dead children. Strangers fought over corpses. In some towns, flesh was sold in markets, disguised as pork or beef. This was no longer a war for ideals, it had become a war of survival. The Taiping army, once fueled by religious devotion, now relied on violence and terror to maintain control. Cities that resisted were slaughtered. Civilians were forced into labor or drafted into military service. Children were given spears and told to fight. If they refused, they were beaten. If they ran, they were executed. Hong Xiuquan, hidden behind palace walls, claimed victory after victory. But the truth was different. His movement was fracturing. His people were starving, and the country he had promised to save was collapsing into dust. And yet, the bloodshed was far from over. Because as the war continued, new horrors emerged. Horrors that would make the Taiping Rebellion one of the most nightmarish episodes in all of human history. By the mid-1850s, the Taiping Rebellion had exploded into a full-scale civil war across southern and central China. While the Qing government tried to reclaim control, the Taiping forces pressed further north. But in between the marching armies were millions of civilians, ordinary people, crushed by two opposing ideologies and starved by a country in flames. Nowhere was safe. Cities that opened their gates to the Taiping were consumed from within. Those that resisted were wiped from the map. Whether ruled by the Qing or the Taiping, towns across China faced the same future: fire, famine, and fear. The Taiping military strategy was relentless. When advancing on a city, they demanded total surrender. If refused, their troops stormed the gates, executed officials, and destroyed government buildings. In the city of Suzhou, over 10,000 prisoners were lined up and killed, their corpses left to rot in public squares as a warning. Blood filled the streets, and the stench of decay seeped into every household. The Qing dynasty responded with equal brutality. Imperial generals launched scorched earth campaigns, burning entire farmlands to deprive the rebels of supplies. Villages suspected of aiding the Taiping were surrounded and set ablaze. Their residents, men, women, and children, burned alive in their homes or shot while trying to escape. Families who had lived peacefully for generations vanished in a matter of hours. In the city of Nanjing, one of the bloodiest sieges of the war unfolded. The Taiping defenders held the city for months against Qing forces. As food ran out, desperate residents boiled tree bark, leather shoes, and straw. Eventually, human flesh became the only available source of nourishment. Eyewitnesses later described men hacking limbs off corpses, mothers killing newborns to feed older children, and residents luring strangers into homes to murder them for meat. These acts were not isolated. They repeated across the war zone. The horror was normalized because nothing else remained. Entire provinces turned into ghost lands. Hunan, Guangxi, Anhui, regions once filled with rice fields and rivers, became zones of death and disease. No trade, no crops, no animals, even rats disappeared. People collapsed in the streets, too weak to move. Disease swept through refugee camps. Cholera, typhus, and smallpox did what bullets could not. The social order collapsed. Schools were abandoned. Temples were desecrated. The elderly were left behind. Children were sold or stolen. In many areas, the only functioning systems were controlled by the military, either Taiping or Qing, and both operated through violence. As the rebellion dragged on, both sides began to conscript civilians into their armies. Teenagers, farmers, monks, beggars, anyone who could walk was given a weapon. In some cases, people were forced to choose between execution or military service. Many who refused were slaughtered publicly to send a message. For the Taiping, military discipline became increasingly cruel. Soldiers were executed for minor mistakes. Women in Taiping-controlled cities were required to follow strict moral codes. Yet many were sexually abused by the same commanders who enforced those codes. Punishments were carried out in public squares. Heads were cut off and placed on poles. Bodies were dragged through streets to instill fear. Even children were not spared. In Nanjing, now known as Tianjin under Taiping control, child labor became mandatory. Boys were recruited to manufacture gunpowder. Girls were forced into sewing uniforms for soldiers. If a child disobeyed, their parents could be whipped or worse. Education was replaced with religious indoctrination. Children memorized Hongshuquan scriptures rather than learning basic reading or mathematics. Those who failed to recite verses were punished. Meanwhile, inside the Qing-controlled zones, life was equally harsh. Fearing rebellion among their own people, Qing authorities arrested citizens for the smallest sign of disloyalty. A peasant caught hiding a Taiping leaflet could be beheaded. A merchant who sold goods to a rebel soldier risked losing his family. Neighbors reported on neighbors. Paranoia spread faster than disease. The economy disintegrated. Trade routes were cut off. Inflation soared. Rice became more valuable than silver. Merchants refused to transport goods through war zones, fearing robbery or execution. Thousands of farmers abandoned their fields, fleeing into forests or mountains. But even isolation could not guarantee safety. Bandits, deserters, and desperate soldiers roamed the countryside, stealing, raping, and killing without consequence. The rebellion had started with ideals, a vision of equality, a promise of heaven on earth. But now, that vision lay shattered in blood and ash. What remained was a battlefield stretching thousands of kilometers, soaked in death and ruled by men with guns. And at the center of it all, Hongshuquan still ruled from his palace in Nanjing, detached from reality, surrounded by luxury, declaring that victory was near. But his people were starving. His soldiers were dying. And across the land, the line between human and monster had all but disappeared. As the war raged across the provinces, the center of the Taiping regime, its so-called heavenly capital in Nanjing, began to rot from within. The man who had once inspired millions, Hongshuquan, had now transformed from revolutionary leader into something far more disturbing. A self-proclaimed divine ruler, detached from human suffering and obsessed with visions of personal glory. In the earliest days of the rebellion, Hong had walked among his people. But now, as the death toll climbed into the millions, he surrounded himself with silk curtains, eunuchs, and a royal court that operated more like a cult than a government. He no longer led armies. He no longer dealt with policy. Instead, he issued revelations, written instructions from God that often made little sense but were treated as absolute law. No one was allowed to question him, and those who did rarely lived long enough to regret it. Hong declared that all authority came directly from heaven, and therefore from him. This belief turned into absolute control over life and death. Senior Taiping commanders, many of whom had helped build the movement from the ground up, began to whisper doubts. Some questioned the food shortages. Others were frustrated by poor strategy and Hong's refusal to engage in real governance. These whispers turned into power struggles. One of Hong's closest allies, Yang Xiuqing, once known as the East King, had grown powerful in military and religious matters. He claimed to speak with the voice of God during his trances. But in 1856, Hong accused him of plotting rebellion. What followed was a purge unlike anything the rebellion had seen before. Yang and his supporters were dragged from their homes in the dead of night, tortured, executed. Their families were not spared. Wives, children, bodyguards, all slaughtered. The streets of Nanjing ran red for days. Corpses were stacked like firewood and burned in public. Those who hesitated to join the purge were themselves accused of treason. Historians estimate that between 20,000 and 30,000 people were killed during this internal cleansing. by their own side. This was not a military victory. This was a collapse of sanity. After the purges, Hong grew increasingly paranoid. He shut himself away, speaking to no one except a small circle of loyal aides. He stopped eating regular meals and consumed nothing but sacred fruit, reportedly melons and herbs, which he claimed were divinely approved. He refused to speak directly to his generals. Instead, he sent cryptic notes filled with religious imagery and bizarre metaphors. Some commands made no sense. Others directly contradicted each other. With leadership paralyzed, chaos spread through the ranks. The commanders who remained became tyrants in their own right. In regions under Taiping control, many began implementing their own forms of justice: public beatings, forced confessions, and executions for crimes as small as missing prayer services. In some cities, residents were forced to attend mass religious ceremonies where the sick and weak were beaten for lacking faith. Women, once promised equal rights under Taiping law, were particularly vulnerable. While some had initially risen to leadership roles, by the late stages of the rebellion, most had been pushed into silence. Those who disobeyed orders, declined arranged marriages, or were accused of dishonor faced violent punishment. Some were buried alive for suspected infidelity. Others were locked in wooden cages and left in public squares to starve as a warning. Hong Xiuquan's version of heaven had turned into a theocratic nightmare. And yet, in his writings, Hong claimed everything was going according to plan. He spoke of divine signs, celestial battles, and the coming final victory. He told his followers that angels were watching, that suffering was a test, that the more pain they endured, the closer they were to salvation. But there was no salvation. The heavenly kingdom had stopped expanding. The Taiping armies, once massive and disciplined, were losing ground. By 1864, the walls of Nanjing trembled with cannon fire. Qing forces had surrounded the city. Starvation had turned the heavenly capital into a tomb. And at its center was a broken, delusional man, praying to a god who no longer answered. Outside the city, the Qing army gathered. Inside, those who remained were trapped between loyalty, fear, and despair. The siege of Nanjing was not a single battle. It was a slow, choking death. Qing troops bombarded the city day and night with artillery imported from the west. Smoke blanketed the skyline. Buildings crumbled. Streets were reduced to rubble. For over 200 days, no food entered the city walls. Meanwhile, Hong Xiuquan remained hidden in his palace, claiming that divine forces would protect them. He refused to surrender. He refused to retreat. Instead, he issued final edicts declaring that those who died for the heavenly kingdom would be reborn in paradise. These were the words of a man who had stopped caring for life on earth. Then, in June of 1864, he died. Some accounts claim he fell ill from the conditions of the siege. Others say he starved alongside his followers. One rumor even suggests he poisoned himself after realizing the end was near. Whatever the truth, the divine ruler of the heavenly kingdom was gone. His body was reportedly buried in secret to avoid panic. But the panic came anyway. Taiping leadership fell into chaos. Hong's teenage son, barely 15 years old, was named the new heavenly king, but he had no authority and no experience. The generals, demoralized and divided, had no strategy. Qing troops continued tightening the noose. On July 19th, Qing forces launched their final assault on Nanjing. Explosives detonated beneath the city walls, creating massive breaches. Soldiers surged through the holes. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. The streets ran red with blood. Qing troops executed anyone suspected of being a Taiping supporter. Civilians, unable to flee, were cut down by swords or bayoneted in alleys. Children were trampled. Pregnant women were stabbed. Survivors were herded into public squares and slaughtered. The massacre lasted for days. Reports from Qing officers describe piles of bodies taller than carts, rivers clogged with corpses, and entire districts reduced to blackened skeletons. Some survivors were stripped, branded, and sold into slavery. Others were beheaded one by one. The city, once envisioned as heaven on earth, became the largest open-air graveyard in Chinese history. When the smoke cleared, an estimated 100,000 people had died in the final days of Nanjing alone. But the horror did not end with the fall of the city. Across the country, Qing forces continued purging rebel strongholds. Villages once aligned with the Taiping were punished through execution and destruction. Former soldiers were hunted down and publicly humiliated before being killed. Anyone who had served under Hong was a target. Worse still, the rebuilding process ignored the suffering that had unfolded. The Qing dynasty, eager to project strength, suppressed records of the full brutality. Civilian deaths were underreported. Incidents of cannibalism were left out of official archives. Survivors were discouraged from speaking. The focus shifted toward economic recovery and re-establishing imperial authority, while millions of voices were buried with the ashes. What historians now know has come from memoirs, foreign observers, and scattered local documents, many hidden for decades. The final toll of the Taiping Rebellion is difficult to comprehend. Most estimates place the number of dead at over 20 million. Some suggest it may have been closer to 30 million. This makes it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, surpassing the First World War, rivaling even the Second. The West, distracted by its own colonial ambitions and internal conflicts, paid little attention. Missionaries wrote home about strange religions and violent peasants, but few understood the depth of suffering. Chinese officials, once the war ended, saw no value in exposing the full horror of what had occurred. And so, history moved on. But the legacy remained. In the decades that followed, China would face more invasions, more revolutions, more pain. But the ghost of the Taiping Rebellion lingered. In the ruined temples, in the changed maps, in the silent fear passed from grandparents to grandchildren. Today, few outside of China know this story. Fewer still know the scale of its cruelty. But to ignore it is to ignore a warning about what happens when idealism turns to fanaticism, when the hunger for power consumes morality, when ordinary people are caught in the jaws of a dream that becomes a nightmare. The Taiping Rebellion began with a promise of paradise. It ended with a mountain of corpses. That is its legacy.